In my second series on the question of why good people conflict with one another and the history of the Christian church and its struggle, then I want to go to the history of the early church in what's called the Book of Acts in chapter 20. But I do want to say we need to recognise that conflict between leaders is part of the whole human experience. I mean, after all, in this new millennium where we're supposed to have sorted out so many issues, we are, as much as ever, in real serious conflict. And it's conflict between Jews and your Palestinians. It's conflict between left and right in the upcoming American elections. It's conflict between Christians and Muslims. I mean, the conflict between leading figures around the world is as severe today as it's ever been. It's as severe as it was when I was a child born in 1942, at the worst year, I think, of the World War, of the Second World War, when it looked like Hitler was going to win. I mean, this is part of the human experience. Now, we could either end up just playing the political game and giving up on it and saying, well, that's the way we are. Or for those of us that are Christians, I believe we should at least be able to set a model for others to see. Because when Jesus came, I don't believe he came just to say, you as individuals are loved by God and you can all get saved. I believe when he came, he addressed the whole human condition. And one of the things he called us to in his great speeches like the Sermon on the Mount, which Mahatma Gandhi said was the greatest of all religious statements, even to his Hindu friends, he said that. That Sermon on the Mount has amazing statements like, blessed are the merciful and blessed are the peacemakers. So to me, it matters that we who claim to be followers of Jesus can really walk in a path that will set an example. And I want to say to my Christian leadership friends, having been through some shocking experiences in my own leadership of failures to be able to resolve conflict, I want to say, if we say we believe in reconciliation through the message of Jesus, then surely we are the people that must set the example more than anybody else as to how one deals with conflict and how one deals with that innate kind of hostility that that occurs so often between leaders and followers. Now, my favourite passage is Acts chapter 20, and I'll read it to you in a reasonably old translation, and it says this. And now, says St. Paul, who's meeting with the eldership of the church of Ephesus, and there's a whole book called the Book of Ephesians, that is Paul's letter to the Ephesian Christians. And I'll come to that in one of the later of these series on conflict and resolution and bringing about peace and wholeness. But at this stage, let me just say, this is Paul meeting for his last time with the leadership of the church of Ephesus, a very famous church, in which he had placed later on a man called Timothy, a young man who he trusted and believed was a good man. And in his letters to Timothy, he appoints Timothy to be the pastoral leader of this group. And that's significant, because here it says in this record in the book of Acts, and now, compelled by the Spirit, I'm going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there. I only know that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. Well, of course, that became true, and some of his letters, like those to Timothy, were written while he was actually in prison awaiting execution. So what he says here becomes quite historically true later on. He says, however, I consider my life worth nothing to me if only I may finish the race and complete the task that Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the gospel of God's grace. Now that's significant because you've got to ask, what was this message of Jesus that has so transformed a Jewish bigot who initially was, it would appear, sending Christian leaders to their death because of his hostility towards this new charismatic Jesus movement? What is this he's saying? What is this gospel? And later on, as we look at some of the epistles of St. Paul, we'll find he lays this out very clearly, what this gospel is. And it's a gospel of grace, a gospel of mercy, a gospel of forgiveness, a gospel of reconciliation. And that's very significant as we look at this subject later on. He says, now I know that none of you among whom I've gone about preaching this kingdom of Jesus will ever see me again. Therefore, I want to say to you, I'm innocent of the blood of all men, for I'm not hesitated to proclaim to you the whole will of God. Now, this is the really important bit that I want my own leaders to hear, and I want other Christian leaders to hear. He says, keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Now, elsewhere when we read the story of St. Paul, he talks about being called of God to go around and appoint elders over these new communities of faith, which we understand were probably extended households. They didn't start off as massive, big mega churches like we have today. They would have been a small group of families, probably in the homes of reasonably wealthy people who were willing to support this new religious movement and open up their homes. Paul speaks once of thanking God for the church that meets in the house of Chloe. Now we know that Chloe must have been a wealthy woman, number one. Number two, she obviously wasn't married because under Roman law, if she was, her possessions would have been passed over to the ownership of her husband. So Chloe was probably a single, wealthy woman who obviously had a far bigger house than average in the Roman jurisdiction of things, and she'd opened her home to be the place where a small Christian church of believers would gather together. So he's saying, in this case, watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Now this is probably a cluster of house churches rather than a big denominational thing, but nevertheless, elders had been appointed to be the pastoral carers, and so he describes them like they are keepers of a flock of sheep, some sort of shepherd that cares for the sheep in that group. And then he says this, be shepherds of the church of God, which bought you with his own blood. Now, when I listen to people saying, I love Jesus, but I hate the church, it's always troubled me because it's like saying to me, I love you, John, and your church at St. Martin's, but I don't like your wife, so I won't have anything to do with you. I mean, it's not going to work. And however imperfect is the family of God, the Jesus of the Bible shed his blood, not just to save the individual, I found Jesus, I'm born again bit, but seriously to bring human beings together in a faith-based love, in a faith-based community of mercy, because Jesus said, I prefer mercy over judgment. A calling for us not to be a bunch of self-righteous, judgmental people that are looking down on others who don't come up to our standard, but a group that recognise our whole communal sinning and failure and come together to try and bring wholeness and healing in the way in which God originally intended for his human beings. So it says, be shepherds of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood. And then he says this, I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. Even your own number of men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw disciples after them. So be on your guard and remember that for 3 years I never stopped warning each of you night and day with tears. Now this little section, this number 2 section on the subject of conflict, is to remind us that the conflicts that happen are the things that bring us unstuck internally, not externally. In actual fact, attack against our faith from outside, we shouldn't get uptight and get out there and want to attack our enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies and do good to those that do bad stuff to you. The biggest enemy is from within, not from without. It's when those of us together inside of the community of faith lose our sense of mission, stop following the ways of Jesus, the ways of mercy, the ways of reconciliation, the ways of love, the ways of forgiveness. When we do that, then we bring our own presentation unstuck. And that's why Jesus said, and I'll come to this later on in another session, but that's what Jesus said when he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And Paul's saying, watch out. The biggest danger is not people that attack you from outside. The enemy from outside is not really the enemy at all. The enemy from outside is so often the people who don't understand what we're on about. And they're the people we must prove the fact of our commitment to love, our commitment to forgiveness, our commitment to love our enemy. They're the people that we want to win, not by hostility, but by embracing them in power. But let me finish by saying this. If we, inside of our groups, tear one another apart over power, over leadership games, over territorial conquest, then in the end, we're hardly in a position to speak the message of Jesus to a broken world that's tearing itself apart. We need to resolve our own internal conflicts along the path that Jesus has set. And we'll come to that in another program further in the future.